Would love a cover of the Magdalene Laundries. Okay, let's get into it. Trigger warning before I begin. The story deals with sexual violence, it deals with child abuse, it deals with religious abuse. It's a heartbreaking and fascinating story, but if you're not feeling up to it today, please do scroll on by and I'll see you in the next video. My sources for today's video are the Wikipedia article on the Magdalene Laundries, which is excellent, as well as the 1998 documentary Sex in a Cold Climate. Let's get into it. The Magdalene Laundries were homes for fallen women that operated in Ireland for about 200 years, but they were most active in the 20th century. This idea of a place where you would put a woman who had behaved in a way that society did not deem appropriate was pretty common throughout the world. This is not an unusual thing. It's somewhere where women who had engaged in sex work might go if they could be convinced to quote unquote reform. It could be a place where a woman who had sex out of wedlock and got pregnant, they could go have the baby and give the baby up for adoption and then return to their life in their town free from scandal. So this was not an uncommon practice, but the way that it went down in Ireland in the 20th century is beyond. So let's get into it. The Magdalene Laundries in Ireland started as homes for fallen women, and in this time period, fallen women were prostitutes, and they were founded in order to help reform people who engaged in sex work. Magdalene being named after Mary Magdalene, who it is said, although this is controversial, it is said in some translations of the Bible that she was a prostitute who was forgiven by Jesus. They operated these institutions to try to fix prostitution in Ireland, to solve prostitution. Well, as we all know, prostitution is not a moral problem. It is an economic problem, and it's not even actually a problem. It's just a thing that people do sometimes for money, and it's okay. Like, it's actually fine. But they were trying to save these women's souls. So they were not very effective. Obviously, they did not solve the problem of prostitution in Ireland, which is not a problem. They, in fact, didn't make any difference at all in this issue. But what they did find as they were doing this work, that having women in an institution where they are doing work for free in exchange for their souls being saved is actually fairly profitable for the order who ran the institution. So let's get into that. In the 20th century, the church had fallen on some hard times. The church was not as popular as it had been. Like all religions in the 20th century, they saw a decline in popularity. They saw somewhat of a lessening of faith in religious institutions. World War I really threw people for a loop. They're like, is there a God? So the church was seeing some decline, and there was a decline in people who were deciding to become priests and nuns, which means that these religious orders were a little bit strapped for cash. Now they're perpetually strapped for cash. This happens every now and then, like that. These institutions aren't earning money, so they need money. And they realized that this system where they have women come work in the laundries for free in order to reform their souls was actually profitable for the institutions. It was actually bringing money in. So what happened in the 20th century is that the church started looking for more fallen women to come into these laundries and work for free to bring money into these institutions, and they started expanding these institutions. As they're expanding these institutions, they're expanding the definition of what it means to be a fallen woman. And they stop looking to reform these women and start looking for women who will be a part of these institutions long-term or permanently. Now, there's a lot of ways that the church contributed to the disenfranchisement of these women. One of the things was teaching that all talk of sexuality, all self-knowledge of your physicality, the human body, all of these things were shameful, all of these things were sinful. Therefore, women in particular tended to be ignorant of the birds and the bees, the biological processes about sex in any way. And so they would be vulnerable to accidental pregnancy because they would be in a relationship with a man and they wouldn't know how to prevent pregnancy, whether they wanted it or not. And so they would end up pregnant and would be in a situation where they're unwed and pregnant. The church also taught that any kind of sexual contact at all, any kind of sexual activity was sinful, whether you were willing or not. So women who were assaulted were also looked on as fallen women, whether they had wanted this or not, and their families would see them this way. So women who had been assaulted, even if they didn't get pregnant sometimes, would just preemptively get sent to the Magdalene Laundry. In the documentary Sex in a Cold Climate, there's a woman who was sent from an orphanage that was run by the nuns. In her teenage years, she was sent to an asylum, to the laundry, to work. She was told that she had a job had been found for her there. She was just sent to the asylum straight from the orphanage and not told why until months and years later when they tell her, oh, actually you were just really pretty, and they assumed that you were just going to get pregnant at some point, so they wanted to go ahead and send you anyway. So it was that level of thin reasons to send women away that were being used to justify putting women in these asylums. And I want to mention that in a previous video that I did about Sinead O'Connor, I mentioned that she, as a teenager in the 80s, was taken to an asylum because she was considered to be a difficult child. So it didn't take much for people to end up in these asylums. Once they were there, they were forced to work in the laundries for 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. They were not paid. They were given shapeless garments and their hair was cut. It was sometimes shaved as punishment. If they resisted any piece of the regime in the laundries, they could be beaten. They were slapped, they were punched, they were beaten with the leather strap that the nuns wore around their waists. So they were brutalized while they were in these laundries if they resisted in any way. These were actual prisons. They had high walls, they had locked gates, they had barbed wire. You could not climb over these gates. The women were locked into their dormitories at night. So they were imprisoned. The most heartbreaking story in Sex in a Cold Climate is the story of a woman who was dating a soldier. She got pregnant and was sent to a home to give birth. She was forced to give up her baby after being with him for 10 months and was just told that she was being sent away. She had been writing letters to the soldier that she was dating because she would have loved to marry him. And he came to visit her and told her to name the baby after him and was, who knows what would have happened, but he was writing to her, but the nuns weren't sending the letters. Like she was being purposefully kept from this man because the nuns wanted her in the system. And so she was separated from her baby. She was sent to an asylum to work. She was not given any choice. Her family rejected her because of her having a baby out of wedlock. And so she was forced to stay in this laundry. But she ended up eventually rebelling, escaping. She full on escaped, out of a door. She escaped to a friend's house. She had to escape this place. These institutions were open until 1996 in Ireland. They closed very, very recently, and they only really closed because washing machines were more common, and it didn't make economic sense to send your laundry out anymore. It is wild. These institutions were around for a very, very, very long time. And the church is still not disclosing exactly how many people that they had in these institutions, but it's estimated to be around 30,000 in the 20th century. This is a fascinating story, and there was a lot I wasn't able to get to, so let me know your questions in the comments.